Hi everyone, welcome to the webinar Silica Made Simple. So this webinar was initially designed to be geared toward foremen, supervisors, and managers who maybe hadn't had a full silica course before, but needed a really good foundation in understanding how exposures happen and how to prevent them. This is a really quick, easy presentation, even including the title slide. It's only 15 slides. We're going to make our way through it pretty quickly, but it's full of really good information that's going to help you understand the topic and give you a really clear idea what it's all about. So that's why I'm redoing it, and so I hope you enjoy it. Now, to start off with, who am I to talk about crystalline silica? Well, first off, my name is Rachel Walla. I'm a certified industrial hygienist, which means my expertise is in preventing workplace exposures to hazardous substances, and I'm a certified safety professional. I have 10 years of experience. I started out with working in industrial hygiene, being a field safety person, working my way up to safety manager at a large manufacturing facility. And now I do safety consulting and I am a safety training creator because I love making these dry, boring topics interesting. And the cool thing for you guys is silica actually is interesting and it's relatively simple. So this will be a fun course. Okay, so here are the 6 key points that we're going to cover today. Silica Basics, what it is, where you'll find it, why we worry about it, how exposures occur, so pretty basic stuff there. Silica in the body, this is where it gets pretty cool because we talk about once you inhale it, what it actually does and why it may be harmful to your health. Then next, identifying hazards so we know where we may be at risk of exposure. Then we'll go over the OSHA limits, making them easy to understand and kind of taking some of the guesswork out of it. And then next is reducing exposures. So, Silica Basics. You may not have known this before. In fact, I didn't realize it was so abundant in the Earth's crust until I did the research for this. But the mass of Earth's crust is 59% silica. And when silica and oxygen combined, we get silica dioxide, making up crystalline silica. So it's the main ingredients in more than 95% of known rocks. So that means today's class is basically about rocks. But as you know, rocks themselves are not hazardous for us to be exposed to. The rock dusts are. Now, the reason that crystalline silica is a hazard now, although it's been known about for hundreds of years, it wasn't as big of a problem until the Industrial Revolution. And the reason is the dust is so much finer now, and with our mechanical processes, we can inhale so much more of it, and so much more of it gets dispersed in air that it becomes a problem. Now, if you think of the dust, what we're actually talking about today isn't the dust that's coarse, maybe like the pepper in a pepper shaker. Those particles are too big. We're actually talking about the really fine dust that's maybe more the same particle size as, say, flour that you would use for baking or powdered sugar, those types of things. So just so you know going forward, that's kind of about the area that we're looking at. So how exposure occurs is we can get exposed to airborne silica dust anytime we're doing cutting on any sort of rock. So think of quartz, granite, concrete cutting, or when we're using some sort of a rock-based media, such as abrasive blasting media and fracking media. All of those can be sources of exposures. In this slide, we're just talking about some of the most basic ones because there's honestly too many to list them all out. But anytime you're cutting a rock, it's a good idea to ask yourself, okay, is this a potential silica exposure? So as we talked about, we're worried about the really fine rock dust. And the thing is that if you can't visualize it, it's hard to say what we're looking at. And so I really like this graphic from the Visual Capitalist. What you can see here is the human hair, how big that is. Then it goes beach sand, salt, dust particles, blood cells. You can even see coronavirus there, the third from the bottom. What we're looking at are particles that are 10 microns in diameter or less. That's what's respirable. So when we get talking about crystalline silica, all you're going to hear over and over is they're going to put those two words together. Respirable silica, respirable silica. Respirable are the really fine, tiny particles. And I'll show you why. So if you look at this image above step 1, what we're looking at are the 3 different places that particles that we inhale can get deposited in our mouth, throat, and lungs. So inhalable are those bigger particles. So let's say you're working in a dusty environment all day. At the end of your shift, you blow your nose, and when you look in the Kleenex, sorry guys, this is gross, but it's brown. That's basically because you inhaled a bunch of dust, your mucous membranes trapped it, and were able to work it out. That's not stuff that's that big of an exposure concern because it's too big to get into our deep lungs. Next is thoracic. That may be something that you kind of cough up or something that's in your throat, but that doesn't get into your deep lung. When we say respirable silica, that is the little tiny particles, the particles that are about the size of flour or fine dust particles that get into the deep lungs. So now you know, anytime you hear people talking about respirable silica, they're not talking about all rock dust, they're talking about the really, really fine rock dust. So what happens when it gets into your lungs? So once it's in your lungs basically treat these little tiny, tiny rock particles like you would treat a sliver. Let's say you get a sliver on your finger's gonna swell up a little bit, and that's your body's way of creating some pressure to kind of work that sliver out. Your lungs are gonna swell, and it's gradually gonna lead to areas of hardened tissue because they can't work the silica out. So what's going to happen is rather than working that little bit of silica out, it's going to form scar tissue all around it. And so scar tissue doesn't heal and it doesn't expand like you need your lungs to when you breathe in. So every time you breathe in, if you have a lot of silica exposure, rather than expanding, you've got these little knots of scar tissue that are just going to move like that. So they're little tiny minuscule bits of scar. It doesn't seem like a big deal, but if you're exposed to silica over a long career or a lot in a short amount of time, that can add up because as this happens over and over, every day you're exposed to a tiny little bit, eventually your lungs can no longer expand. And then when we get to step 4, you actually have diminished lung capacity, silicosis, which is the main disease that results, lung cancer, COPD, and kidney disease. So the thing with silicosis and all of these diseases that are related to silica is they are irreversible. So once you start down that path, you can't really clear up these symptoms and have your lungs be good as new again. But they are also preventable. So what you want to keep in mind here is the best approach is just preventing it in the first place from happening because it's progressive, it's debilitating, and can be fatal. So the signs and symptoms of silicosis can be things like shortness of breath, fatigue, chest pain, respiratory failure, risk of lung infections, and weight loss. And they're kind of hard to notice because if you think about it, those are pretty subtle signs. And for a lot of us, if we had those symptoms, especially during the last year, your first thought may actually be, oh, maybe I have COVID. But this can be associated with so many other health problems. Sometimes it doesn't get recognized for what it is for several years. Now, diseases that are associated with silica, we talked a little bit about. Silicosis is one, lung cancer, COPD, and kidney disease. Now, how this usually looks if somebody gets it, or how it may look, because every case is a little bit different, there is no recovery. So some first start to notice lung problems. They even describe it occasionally as feeling like they have a smoker's cough, but maybe they've never smoked. Then maybe they feel tired all the time. Again, these are subtle signs. How many of us feel tired all the time? Jobs that used to be easy become difficult. So maybe something like mowing your lawn or loading up the truck for work every day. So breathing is hard because you feel like you're breathing hard. So maybe you're breathing frequently. Your breaths are frequent, but you aren't getting enough air. So it's a pretty rough one and you can't reverse it. So you got to prevent it. Okay. So the way to prevent it is to identify your exposure hazards and then take steps to reduce those hazards. So first off, do you have silica containing materials? So granite, quartz, agate, ceramic, slate, glass, stone, sandblasting media, fracking media, concrete, and many others. So there's quite a few. This list isn't exhaustive, but it's a good start. Then ask yourself, are any of the processes you're doing generating dust? If they are, they're things like cutting, sawing, grinding, abrasive blasting, all those sorts of things. If they're generating dust, there's the potential for it to be airborne and for somebody to inhale it. Now, are there people in the area that can inhale it? And if these are all three yeses, then yes, you probably have the potential for an exposure. So any processes that aren't completely enclosed are probably going to be ones where there is the potential for somebody to inhale it. And even if they are completely enclosed, then you also have to think about, okay, what about when we go do maintenance in there? Or what about when we go in there to clean? Those types of things. So these three things add up to an exposure. Now, when we know it's possible to be exposed, the next question becomes, well, how much is too much? And a few years ago, OSHA decreased what they said was the permissible exposure limit. Now, the permissible exposure limit was initially set when OSHA was instituted in 1972. So we have enough data now. We know that that was not protective enough. And with OSHA's estimate of 2.3 million people being exposed to silica at work every year, we have a large population of people who to be concerned about here. So we know enough to know that we had to reduce the level. So when you go to start getting into this stuff, it may be kind of confusing how they measure it, but basically they measure it based on how much air we breathe. So we breathe a volume of air, and rough estimates are everybody breathes a different amount, but you probably breathe somewhere between 3 and 4 cubic meters of air per shift. So the OSHA limit is based on a weight per cubic meter of air. So you can be exposed to 50 micrograms, so a tiny amount, 50 micrograms per cubic meter of air per shift. So based on the best estimates, if you're exposed to that much, you're not going to have these debilitating health effects. Now, if we get even up to 25 micrograms per cubic meter, that's when employers must take action to prevent exposures. And if you look at the OSHA code, there's a whole route of things that you have to do. If you have it over the action limit, then you have to resample at a certain duration. If you're above the action limit, you have to take steps to reduce exposures. And all it's about is basically reducing exposures. It's not a super complicated approach, but we want to make sure that we're measuring to know exactly where we are in terms of what employees are getting exposed to, and then verify when we've reduced those exposures. Now, when it comes to reducing exposures, the good thing about silica is when you're exposed to it, it works in your body like a mechanical process. It's not some chemical that's going to transform 10 times and become something completely different or anything like that. It's pretty simple. So all we want to do is get to it before people breathe it in. Basically like vacuums on a saw that will pull the dust away before anybody inhales it. Or HEPA filtered vacuums for cleaning up rock dust. Of course, if you're doing any sort of grinding or sawing, wet methods are going to be the best because they're going to prevent it from becoming airborne. And then also we have PPE, so things like respirators, and N95s are considered respirators, so that's why they're on there as well. Now, one of the cool and helpful things that OSHA did when it comes to silica is in their language, they put this table 1 of all the different control methods. Usually they don't get that prescriptive, but it's actually really helpful, and it's several pages long. So depending on what kind of work you do, you can probably find something that's applicable for you there. But what they do is they give you the equipment, the task, and then the types of controls. They have engineering and work practice controls. And then if personal protective equipment like a respirator is required. So let's take the top level example, stationary masonry saws. Okay, pretty simple. If you're going to be using those and you have a saw that's equipped with an integrated water delivery system that continuously feeds water to the blade, you're not required to wear a respirator. So pretty simple. So go through the list, find tools that are similar to what you have, and start looking into what controls you can put in place to limit the exposure. And in the meantime, get an industrial hygienist like myself or somebody else out there to do sampling so you know what your levels are. As we talked about, You cannot reverse the effects of silicosis, but you can prevent it. So prevention is key. It's always the best to control the exposure at the source rather than going around and trying to deal with it after somebody's been exposed to it. And then you want to use the hierarchy of controls. So remember, those engineering controls are on the top. Those are the most effective. And if you are a supervisor, a business owner, or something like that, they're the easiest as well because they can work all the time. So things like enclosures, if you've got a fully enclosed saw system, that's great. Dust collectors, ventilation, all of those are reliable systems. On the other hand, if we go down to the next level, administrative controls, those are things like your policies, your procedures, your rules. You know, we've got a danger sign here. These things work if employees know about them, know how to use them, and always use them. But we know with having more turnover in the workplace and also with just the errors that people make and that sometimes it's really hard to keep up with training, there can be holes in that. And so it's not as effective as engineering controls. And the last and least effective method are respirators, so your PPE. Respirators do definitely help, so I'm not downgrading that, but I am saying if you're going to approach it with a respirator, you want to use these other controls that are more effective first. The problem with respirators is people have to be fit tested, they have to wear them, they have to maintain them correctly, and they have to be clean shaven, because again, we're talking about those little tiny particles. If you are not clean shaven and you have a little bit of a gap around where that respirator is fitting, you're still going to be inhaling some. Employees need to know about the hazards associated with exposure to respirable silica, and they need to be able to take steps that can protect themselves, like we talked about engineering controls, work practice controls, PPE. Having a good training program that really helps employees to understand what they can do to protect themselves and why they should is a really key component in all of this. People do better when they know better, and so if they've been trained, they'll understand why it's important. If they haven't been trained, oftentimes they don't take the controls seriously because they don't know why it should matter to them. You know, and silica is one of those things where, especially when it's rock dust, people don't see it like they would say a radioactive exposure, where initially they're worried about it. Instead, they think, oh, it's just dust, it won't hurt you. But it does, and we have a lot of data backing that up. So we definitely want to do a good, purposeful, focused training for employees. Also, if you're to the point where you have exposures over the permissible exposure limit and you have a medical surveillance program to keep those employees healthy, they need to know about the purpose of that, how to wear their respirator, all the respiratory training. So just depending on how high your levels are, there can be a lot of different layers here. Okay, so once you've identified your hazards, gotten some controls in place, done training, it's continuous improvement. The companies that get really good at managing silica are the ones that continue to manage it as a continuous improvement process. So plan, you know you're gonna have an exposure. Do would be do something to reduce the exposures, like engineering controls. Check, get monitoring in there, industrial hygiene sampling to see what your actual levels are. Because remember, if you can measure it, you can manage it. What doesn't get measured doesn't get managed. And then check and adjust as you go along. So you've got this constant stream of making sure you're doing the right thing, keeping things clean, keeping employees safe and healthy. That's where companies do a lot better at this, is if they integrate it into their process, just like you would your preventative maintenance plan, quality control, housekeeping, or any other business operation. If you're gonna do business that involves silica, make it part of your operation to do business safely and to keep employees healthy. So thank you so much for watching. I hope that was helpful for you. That's just a brief introduction to silica. Let me know if you have any questions, and hopefully that helps you to get off the ground with the basics of what you need to know about preventing silica exposures in the workplace.